Kennedy also had a chance to restore American prestige in another crisis with Cuba. The Soviet Union, disturbed by the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion, had pledged to support Castro's government. On October 16, 1962, photographs were taken from an American U-2 spy plane that revealed that the Soviets were building missile bases on Cuban soil, only about 90 miles from the island of Key West, Florida. What followed was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a terrifying standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet missiles in Cuba did not radically change the military balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets could already inflict serious damage on the United States from bases within their own country. Yet installing missiles so close to the United States seemed to be an effort by the Soviets to intimidate the Americans. Kennedy was convinced that the missiles presented a direct challenge to which he must respond. But how? The president quickly assembled his top advisors in a series of secret meetings. They outlined 4 possible responses. 1. Engage in further negotiations with Khrushchev. 2. Invade Cuba. 3. Blockade Cuba. 4. Bomb the missile sites. Attorney General Robert Kennedy argued against the airstrike option. It seemed, he said, too much like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that had launched the United States into World War II. At one point, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson joined the discussions and declared that the United States had to knock out the Soviet missiles. He was asked what would happen next. His response points out the very real danger of the local conflict escalating or expanding into a widespread war. Acheson said, "I know the Soviet Union well. I know what they are required to do in light of their history and their posture around the world. I think they will knock out our missiles in Turkey." An advisor said, "Well, then what do we do?" Acheson said, "I believe under our NATO treaty, we would be required to respond by knocking out a missile base inside the Soviet Union." Another advisor asked, "Then what do they do?" Acheson replied, "That's when we hope that cooler heads will prevail and they'll stop and talk." President Kennedy ordered U.S. forces on full alert. U.S. bombers were armed with nuclear missiles. The Navy was ready to move, and the Army and Marine units prepared to invade Cuba. Kennedy listened to the different views of his advisors, grilling them with questions. Then in solitude, he weighed the options, facing one of the most dangerous and agonizing decisions any president has had to make. On Monday, October 22nd, Kennedy went on television and radio to confirm the press reports that had begun to circulate about Cuba. Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The president then announced his decision. He had authorized a naval quarantine around Cuba. He was careful not to call the action a blockade, because a blockade is an act of war. He demanded that Khrushchev halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat. America did not desire confrontation, Kennedy said, but neither would it shrink from aggression. He told the American people, "The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards. The cost of freedom is always high, and Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission." President Kennedy, television and radio address to the nation, October 22, 1962. The 2 most powerful nations in the world stood teetering on the brink of disaster. The immediate public reaction was a mixture of anger and fear, but no panic, as they rallied in support of the president. Some people huddled in their bomb shelters, expecting the worst. The naval quarantine went into full effect on Wednesday, October 24th. On October 25th, the Soviet ship reached a quarantine line and was stopped by the Navy. Because it was only carrying oil, it was allowed to proceed. Meanwhile, a dozen or more Soviet cargo ships were steaming toward the blockade. Then, to everyone's great relief, the Soviet ships suddenly reversed direction. Khrushchev had called them back. The crisis was not yet over, however. In Cuba, construction on the existing missile sites continued. On October 26, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a long letter in which he pledged to remove the missiles if Kennedy promised that the United States would end the quarantine and stay out of Cuba. A second letter, delivered the next day, demanded that the United States remove its missiles from Turkey in exchange for withdrawal of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy publicly accepted the terms of the first note. He responded to the second note through secret negotiations and eventually met the demand, withdrawing U.S. missiles from Turkey. With that, the crisis ended. As Secretary of State Dean Rusk observed to President Kennedy, "We have won a considerable victory. You and I are still alive." The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer than ever before to a nuclear war. Such a war would have caused unimaginable death and destruction. Far more, for example, than the atomic bombings of Japan in 1945, in part because more powerful hydrogen bombs had replaced those early atomic weapons. Kennedy emerged from the confrontation as a hero. He had stood up to the Soviets and shown that the United States would not be pushed around. His reputation and that of the Democratic Party improved just in time for the midterm congressional elections that were only weeks away.